Montana Territory, 1872. A land where strength was measured in acres and grit, where a man stood tall against nature's whims, and where Garrett Evans believed love had no business surviving. The harsh winters, scorching summers, and endless days of backbreaking work had hardened him like the leather of his saddle. At 25, Garrett had already lived several lifetimes' worth of frontier hardship, his ranch, the Starlight, being all that mattered to him since his father's passing 3 years prior. A man with land has all he needs, his father used to say, words Garrett had taken to heart after watching his mother wither away from heartbreak following his father's death. Love, Garrett had concluded, was a liability on the frontier, a weakness that could destroy you when the West demanded nothing but strength. The morning sun painted the distant mountains gold as Garrett leaned against the fence post, surveying his cattle grazing in the valley below. His ranch hands were already at work, tiny figures on horseback in the distance. The Starlight wasn't the biggest spread in Paradise Valley, but it was his, and he'd fought tooth and nail to keep it profitable after the war. His strong jaw clenched as he spotted riders approaching the abandoned Willowbrook Ranch next door, a property that had stood empty since Old Man Peterson had died last winter. Garrett ran a hand through his sandy brown hair, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his Stetson. Neighbors meant complications, and complications threatened the delicate balance of his existence. He had carefully constructed a life of solitude, believing that keeping people at arm's length was the surest way to protect what was his. Little did he know that his carefully constructed walls were about to face their greatest challenge. Liliana Whitfield clutched the letter from her uncle's attorney as the stagecoach bounced mercilessly along the rutted road toward Paradise Valley. At 22, with honey blonde hair pinned imperfectly beneath her fashionable blue bonnet, she was entirely unprepared for what awaited her. Her silk traveling dress, once the height of Boston fashion, was now wrinkled and dust-covered after days of travel. "You'll be arriving shortly, miss," the driver called down, his voice barely audible over the rattling of the coach. Liliana nodded, though he couldn't see her, and returned to her letter. Uncle William's bequest of the Willowbrook Ranch had come as a shock. She'd met the man only twice in her life. After her parents' death from influenza 6 months ago, and the discovery that her father's business had left nothing but debts, the inheritance had seemed like providence. Now, as the vastness of Montana stretched endlessly around her, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Boston society had trained her to pour tea, play piano, and make pleasant conversation, not manage a cattle ranch in the wilderness. But pride and desperation had propelled her westward. "I will not fail," she whispered to herself, though uncertainty gnawed at her. The stagecoach crested a hill, revealing a sprawling valley cut by a winding river, mountains rising majestically in the distance. Despite her exhaustion, Liliana gasped at the raw beauty of it. "Willowbrook's just ahead," the driver called. "Though I should tell you, miss, it ain't been kept up since Peterson passed." The coach rattled down the slope toward a cluster of buildings. As they drew closer, Liliana's heart sank. The main house, a 2-story structure that might once have been handsome, now had peeling paint and a sagging porch. The barn roof had partially collapsed, and fences lay broken in several places. When the coach finally stopped, Liliana stepped down on shaky legs, her gaze sweeping across what was now her property, her salvation or her ruin. "Miss Whitfield," a man approached, evidently the attorney's representative who'd agreed to meet her. Behind him stood 2 ranch hands looking curiously at the city woman who now owned Willowbrook. "Welcome to your inheritance," the man said with a hint of sympathy that made Liliana's stomach tighten. "I'm afraid there's quite a bit of work needed." Liliana squared her shoulders, refusing to let despair overwhelm her. "Then we'd better get started, hadn't we?" Garrett couldn't believe his eyes when he spotted the blonde woman in the ridiculous blue dress standing in Peterson's yard. Women were rare enough in these parts, but one dressed like she'd stepped out of an Eastern catalog was unprecedented. He'd ridden over when he saw the stagecoach arrive, curious about who'd bought Willowbrook. He watched from a distance as the woman walked the property with Collins, the banker's man, her posture becoming increasingly rigid with each new problem they discovered. Even from this distance, Garrett could see the property was in far worse shape than he'd realized. Peterson had been failing for years before his death, and winter had been unkind to the abandoned buildings. Duty and neighborly obligation finally overcame Garrett's reluctance to involve himself. He nudged his horse forward, approaching as the banker's man was pointing out yet another structural issue with the barn. "That roof won't last another winter," Garrett said by way of greeting, tipping his hat as both turned toward him. "You'd be better off rebuilding than repairing." The woman's eyes, a startling blue that reminded him of summer skies, widened slightly. Her face, though dusty from travel, was striking in its delicate features, high cheekbones flushed from sun exposure. "Mr. Evans," Collins nodded. "This is Miss Liliana Whitfield, William Peterson's niece and the new owner of Willowbrook." Niece? Garrett couldn't mask his surprise. Peterson had never mentioned family. "His sister's daughter," Liliana said, her voice carrying the refined accent of the East. She extended her gloved hand with practiced grace. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Mr. Evans." Garrett hesitated before taking her hand briefly. "You planning to sell? Because I should warn you, property out here isn't fetching what it might back east." Something flashed in her eyes, determination, perhaps, or wounded pride. "I'm not selling, Mr. Evans. I intend to restore Willowbrook to working order." He couldn't help the laugh that escaped him. "Ma'am, no disrespect intended, but do you know the first thing about running a ranch?" Her chin lifted slightly. "I'm a quick study, Mr. Evans." Collins cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Whitfield has hired the 2 hands Peterson kept on, though I've explained they won't be enough for a property this size." Garrett surveyed the dilapidated ranch, the broken fencing, the fields overgrown with weeds. "No, they won't be." He looked back at Liliana, taking in her impractical clothes and delicate hands that had clearly never seen a day of labor. "You've got maybe 3 months before winter. Without proper shelter for cattle and stores for winter, you won't last till spring." Her expression hardened. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Evans. I'll take that under advisement." The dismissal was clear, but something, perhaps the memory of his own struggles after his father died, made Garrett hesitate. "The creek that runs through your south pasture dries up by August. You'll need to drive your cattle to the river on my property for water." Surprise flickered across her face. "That's very neighborly of you." "It's what Peterson did," Garrett said with a shrug, already regretting his impulse to help. "A city woman playing at ranching would only bring trouble. Just keep your cattle from straying into my north pasture. I've got to deal with the fort for those beeves." With that, he tipped his hat again, turned his horse, and rode away, telling himself he'd done his duty as a neighbor. The woman would either sell or fail, and neither outcome was his concern. But as he rode home, the image of those determined blue eyes stayed with him, stirring something he'd thought long buried. 3 weeks later, Garrett cursed himself for ever getting involved as he rode hard toward the billowing smoke coming from Willowbrook. He'd heard the gunshots from his south pasture, and his gut had twisted with a dread he couldn't explain. He found chaos when he arrived. 3 men he didn't recognize were driving off Willowbrook cattle, while another exchanged gunfire with Liliana's hands from behind the cover of the corral. Garrett drew his rifle from its scabbard and took aim, sending a warning shot over the rustlers' heads. "That's far enough," he shouted, spurring his horse forward. The unexpected intervention caused enough confusion for the Willowbrook hands to gain the advantage. 2 of the rustlers, seeing the odds turn, mounted quickly and fled. The 3rd threw down his gun. Garrett dismounted, keeping his rifle trained on the surrendering man. "Where's Miss Whitfield?" he demanded of the nearest ranch hand. "In the house," the man gasped, bleeding from a graze on his arm. "She went for the shotgun when they rode in." Heart pounding, Garrett backed toward the house, keeping his eyes on the captured rustler. "Get him secured," he ordered the hands before sprinting to the house. He found Liliana on the porch, a shotgun trembling in her hands as she stared at the captured rustler. Her hair had come loose from its pins, cascading in golden waves down her back, and her dress, a simpler garment than the one she'd arrived in, but still not suited for ranch work, was smudged with dirt. "Miss Whitfield," Garrett said gently, stepping into her line of sight. "It's over now." Her eyes snapped to his, wide with fear but blazing with a fury that took him aback. "They were stealing my cattle," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "My livelihood." "I know." He approached carefully. "Why don't you let me take that?" After a moment's hesitation, she surrendered the shotgun. As Garrett took it, he noticed her hands were blistered and calloused, no longer the soft hands of a city woman. In just 3 weeks, she'd been working, and hard. "Are you hurt?" he asked, scanning her for injuries. She shook her head, a strand of honey-blonde hair falling across her face. "No, but James is shot," and they set fire to the south fence. "The fence can be rebuilt," Garrett said. "Let's see to your man first." As they tended to the wounded hand, Garrett observed the changes to Willowbrook. The porch had been repaired, the barn roof patched, and new fence posts were stacked ready for installation. Liliana moved with purpose, her instructions to the uninjured hand clear and practical. She'd clearly been working from sunup to sundown. Later, after the local sheriff had collected the rustler and James had been bandaged, Garrett found Liliana staring at the damaged fence, shoulders slumped with exhaustion. "You've done a lot in 3 weeks," he said, coming to stand beside her. She didn't look at him. "Not enough, apparently. They thought we'd be easy pickings." "Rustlers target every ranch," Garrett said. "It's not personal. It feels personal when it's all you have." Her voice cracked slightly. If they'd succeeded, understanding dawned on Garrett. "You're not just playing at ranching, are you? This is everything for you." Liliana finally turned to him, her face streaked with soot and determination. "My parents died last winter. Father's business failed. There were debts. This ranch is all I have left in the world, Mr. Evans. I will not fail." The raw honesty in her voice struck something deep in Garrett. For the first time, he saw not an Eastern lady playing at frontier life, but a woman fighting for survival with the same desperate determination he'd felt after his father died. "Then I reckon you could use some help," he heard himself say, surprising them both. Proper help, not just water rights. Hope and wariness battled in her expression. "Why would you help me?" Garrett considered his answer carefully. "Because I know what it's like to have everything riding on making a go of a ranch. And because—" he hesitated, then admitted, "because I judged you wrongly, Miss Whitfield. I thought you'd run at the first sign of trouble." A small, tired smile touched her lips. "I'm still here, Mr. Evans. Call me Garrett," he said, offering his hand. She took it, her calloused palm pressing against his. "Liliana." And just like that, the walls Garrett had built around his heart developed their first hairline crack. Summer blazed across Paradise Valley, the days stretching long and hot as July turned to August. Under Garrett's guidance, Liliana had hired 3 more hands and focused their efforts on making Willowbrook functional before winter. Every day brought new challenges: broken equipment, sick cattle, dwindling funds. But Liliana met each one with a stubborn resilience that continually surprised Garrett. "You need to dig the post holes deeper," Garrett instructed as they worked on rebuilding the fence line rustlers had damaged. "Otherwise, the first heavy snow will knock them down." Liliana, dressed now in a practical split riding skirt and loose blouse, her honey-blonde hair braided down her back, nodded and drove the digger deeper. Her face was tanned from weeks in the sun, her hands strong and sure where they'd once been hesitant. Garrett found himself riding to Willowbrook almost daily, telling himself it was neighborly duty, even as he acknowledged the growing warmth he felt in Liliana's presence. She was unlike any woman he'd known, combining Eastern refinement with a willingness to tackle the hardest work without complaint. "Why did you come west?" he asked one evening as they sat on her newly repaired porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. "Truthfully, you could have sold the ranch from Boston." Liliana was silent for a moment, twisting a handkerchief in her lap. "After my parents died, I discovered how decorative my existence had been. I could play piano, speak French, and pour tea perfectly, but I couldn't support myself. When men came calling after the funeral, I knew they were only interested in my family connections." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "When I learned about the ranch, it seemed like a chance to prove, to myself more than anyone, that I could be more than ornamental." Garrett nodded slowly. "And have you? Proven it to yourself?" A smile spread across her face, transforming her features. "Every day I stay upright in the saddle. Every time I mend a fence or help birth a calf." Her quiet confidence stirred something in Garrett. Admiration, yes, but something deeper too. Something he'd sworn he wouldn't feel again after watching his mother fade away from grief. The next day, Garrett arrived at Willowbrook to find Liliana in heated argument with a man in an expensive suit. Her face was flushed with anger, her posture rigid with defiance. "I've said all I intend to say on the matter," she was saying as Garrett approached. The ranch is not for sale. Miss Whitfield, be reasonable, the man said. The Northern Pacific will be coming through this valley next year. The land value will increase temporarily, yes, but once the big cattle operations move in, small spreads like this won't survive. Is there a problem here? Garrett asked, dismounting. The man turned, assessing Garrett with a businessman's calculating gaze. Lawrence Hargrove, Northern Pacific Railroad. And you are? Garrett Evans. I own the Starlight next door. Hargrove's expression brightened. Ah, excellent. Perhaps you can talk some sense into Miss Whitfield. The railroad is offering fair prices for land along the proposed route. The price isn't the issue, Liliana interjected. I'm not selling at any price. Hargrove sighed dramatically. The railroad will come through regardless, Miss Whitfield. Those who cooperate prosper. Those who don't. He shrugged meaningfully. Something cold settled in Garrett's stomach. He'd heard rumors of the railroad's tactics with reluctant landowners. I believe the lady's made her position clear, Mr. Hargrove. The railroad man's expression hardened. I see. Well, I'll leave my card in case either of you reconsiders. He handed each of them a business card. The offer won't remain open indefinitely. After Hargrove departed, Liliana's shoulders slumped. That's the third offer this month. First the mining company, then the cattle syndicate, now the railroad. Garrett frowned. Why are they so interested in Willowbrook specifically? I don't know. Uncle William's letter just said to hold on to the land, that it would provide for me. She sighed, suddenly looking exhausted. Some days, I wonder if I'm being foolish, turning down good money to struggle with this place. Do you want to sell? Garrett asked carefully, surprised by how much her answer mattered to him. Liliana was quiet for a long moment, her gaze sweeping across the ranch, the buildings they'd repaired, the cattle grazing in the distance, the garden she'd planted behind the house. Finally, she shook her head. No, this is home now. The simple declaration eased something in Garrett's chest. Then we'll make sure you can keep it. As summer began its slow surrender to fall, the unlikely partnership between Garrett and Liliana blossomed into something neither had anticipated. Their evening conversations on the porch stretched longer, their shared laughter came easier, and the accidental brushes of hands while working began to seem less accidental. Garrett found himself thinking of Liliana at odd moments, while mending his own fences, during quiet evenings alone, in the first moments after waking. The walls he'd built around his heart were crumbling, and the realization terrified him. You're sweet on that Whitfield woman, his foreman, Marcus, observed one evening as they returned from checking the herd. Don't be ridiculous, Garrett replied too quickly. Marcus just chuckled. Ain't seen you smile this much since before your pa passed. It's a good look on you, boss. Garrett had no response. The truth was, Liliana had awakened something he'd thought dead. Hope, perhaps, or the dangerous belief that a person could be more than simply a survivor on the frontier. The following Sunday, most of Paradise Valley gathered for the harvest social at the town church. Garrett arrived late, having dealt with a broken wagon wheel, and paused in the doorway of the church hall, scanning the crowd. When he spotted Liliana, his heart stumbled in his chest. She'd abandoned her practical ranch clothes for a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, her honey blonde hair arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. She was speaking with the preacher's wife, smiling in a way that transformed her face, no longer the determined rancher, but a young woman of 22 enjoying a rare moment of leisure. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up, and her smile widened when she saw him. Garrett made his way through the crowd toward her, nodding to neighbors, but never taking his eyes from Liliana. I was beginning to think you weren't coming, she said when he reached her. Wagon wheel broke, he explained. You look. He hesitated, suddenly tongue-tied. Different. Liliana laughed, the sound like music. I believe that's the first time you've seen me in something other than work clothes and dust. Before Garrett could respond, the fiddler struck up a lively tune, and couples moved to the cleared area to dance. Would you care to dance, Miss Whitfield? Garrett asked, extending his hand before he could overthink the gesture. Surprise and pleasure flickered across her face as she placed her hand in his. I would indeed, Mr. Evans. They moved onto the floor, joining the other couples. Garrett hadn't danced in years, but his body remembered the steps. With Liliana in his arms, her hand warm in his, her waist beneath his palm, the music seemed to fade until there was only her, her scent of lavender and sunshine, her eyes bright with enjoyment, her lips curved in a smile meant only for him. "Everyone's watching us," she whispered as he turned her through a figure. Garrett glanced around, noting the curious and approving looks from the townsfolk. "Does that bother you?" "No," she answered honestly. "Does it bother you?" He considered the question as they moved through another turn. Once, he would have hated being the center of attention, hated the speculation he could read in the neighbors' eyes. But now, with Liliana's hand in his, he found he didn't care. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't bother me at all." The evening passed in a blur of dances and conversation. For the first time in years, Garrett felt part of the community rather than merely adjacent to it. When the social ended, he drove Liliana home in his wagon, the night air cool around them, stars scattered like diamonds across the vast Montana sky. "Thank you," Liliana said softly as they approached Willowbrook. "I needed that more than I realized." "The dancing?" Garrett asked. "The reminder that life can be more than just work and worry." She looked at him in the moonlight, her expression open and vulnerable. "When I came west, I thought I was just fighting for survival. I never expected to find." "Find what?" he asked when she didn't continue. Liliana hesitated, then said quietly, "Joy." The word hung between them, simple and profound. Garrett reined the horses to a stop in front of her house, turning to face her fully. "Liliana, A gunshot cracked through the night, shattering the moment. Garrett instinctively pulled Liliana down, covering her body with his as more shots followed. "Get down," he shouted, reaching for the rifle he kept in the wagon. "Stay here." Heart pounding, he leapt from the wagon and ran toward the source of the gunfire, the barn, where an orange glow was already visible. "Fire!" Two of Liliana's hands emerged from the bunkhouse, guns drawn. In the chaos that followed, fighting the fire, searching for intruders, calming spooked horses, Garrett had no time to think about the moment that had been interrupted. By dawn, when the sheriff arrived to investigate, the barn was damaged but standing, no cattle had been lost, and no intruders had been found. This wasn't random, Sheriff Miller concluded, examining the evidence of coal oil used to start the fire. "Someone's sending a message." "The railroad," Liliana said grimly, her fine dress now smoke-stained and torn. "Or the mining company. Or the cattle syndicate. They all want my land." Garrett's jaw tightened with rage. "They won't stop at fires." "No," the sheriff agreed soberly. "I've seen this before. It'll escalate." Liliana's face was pale but determined. "What would you have me do, Sheriff? Sell to whoever's doing this? That would only reward them." Sheriff Miller had no answer for that. After he left, Garrett found Liliana staring at the damaged barn, her expression haunted. "You could come stay at the Starlight," he suggested. "Just until we catch whoever's doing this." She shook her head firmly. "I won't be driven from my home, Garrett." He admired her courage, even as he feared for her safety. "Then I'll stay here. Me and a couple of my hands. We'll take shifts keeping watch." Liliana looked as though she might argue, then nodded, the exhaustion and strain evident in her face. "Thank you." As Garrett arranged for the additional security, he found himself more shaken than he wanted to admit. Not by the fire or the threat, but by the realization that had struck him when those first shots were fired. The bone-deep terror he'd felt had not been for himself, but for Liliana. The thought of losing her had been unbearable, and that realization frightened him more than any threat. October brought the first frost, painting the valley in silver and crystallizing Garrett's dilemma. Every instinct forged through years of frontier life told him to retreat, to protect himself from the vulnerability of caring too deeply. Yet each day spent helping guard Willowbrook, each evening spent in conversation with Liliana, only deepened his feelings. "The cattle syndicate has raised their offer," Liliana told him one evening as they sat by her fireplace, papers spread across the table between them. The attacks had continued, fence lines cut, a water trough poisoned, threatening notes left at the property line, but Liliana's determination hadn't wavered. Garrett examined the letter. The sum was substantial, enough to buy a comfortable life anywhere. "It's a good offer. Better than the last 3, she agreed, watching him closely. "Are you going to tell me I should take it? Would it matter if I did?" A small smile played at her lips. "I value your opinion." Garrett carefully set the letter down. "The money would solve your immediate problems. You could go back east, buy a nice house, never worry about rustlers or droughts, or railroad men. But, she prompted, hearing the unspoken reservation in his voice. But you'd be giving up something that can't be measured in dollars. He met her eyes directly. You've built something here, Liliana. Not just rebuilt a ranch, but built a life. Built connections. The word hung between them, laden with meaning neither had fully acknowledged. Yes, she said softly. I have. Before Garrett could respond, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. One of Liliana's hands stood on the porch, expression grim. Rider coming in fast, he reported. Looks like trouble. The rider was Marcus, Garrett's foreman, his horse lathered from hard riding. Boss, he called as Garrett strode to meet him. The north pasture's on fire. Garrett's blood ran cold. The north pasture, where his prime cattle were fattening for the army contract that would see the starlight through winter. How bad? Started at 3 points. We're fighting it, but with the dry grass. Marcus shook his head grimly. Could lose it all. I have to go, Garrett told Liliana, already mounting his horse. I'm coming with you, she said, turning to her hand. Jimmy, get everyone up and ready. Follow us with the water wagon. Garrett wanted to protest, to tell her to stay safe at Willowbrook, but there was no time. Together they rode hard toward the starlight, the glow of the fire visible long before they reached the north pasture. The scene was chaos. Flames whipped by the wind raced through the dry autumn grass. Cattle bellowed in panic, and Garrett's men worked desperately to control the blaze and move the herd to safety. For hours they fought together, digging fire breaks, beating back flames, driving terrified cattle to safety. Garrett lost track of time, aware only of the relentless fire and the constant, reassuring presence of Liliana working tirelessly at his side. Dawn broke to reveal the devastation. Nearly half the pasture burned, dozens of cattle lost, the rest scattered. As Garrett surveyed the damage, exhaustion and defeat threatened to overwhelm him. The army contract, he said hollowly. Without those cattle. Liliana, her face smudged with soot, her hair singed in places, took his hand firmly in hers. You'll meet the contract. We'll combine our herds. Garrett stared at her. What? My cattle. They're not as prime as yours were, but they're healthy. We'll combine what you have left with mine to fill the contract. Liliana, that's your winter income. Without it, I'll manage, she said firmly. But the starlight needs that contract. The selflessness of her offer stunned him. Why would you do that? Her gaze never wavered. Because I care about what happens to you, Garrett Evans. Because what matters to you matters to me. In that moment, covered in soot and exhaustion, Liliana had never looked more beautiful to him. All the walls he'd built, all his determinations to remain isolated and protected, crumbled in the face of her unwavering support. Liliana, he began, but was interrupted by Marcus calling his name urgently. Boss, you need to see this. Near the origin point of one of the fires, Marcus had found evidence that turned Garrett's exhaustion to rage. A coal oil can with the railroad's mark and a claim notice for the starlight, dated the following week. They're not just after Willowbrook, Liliana realized, her face pale beneath the soot. They want both ranches. For the rail line, Garrett said grimly. Our properties control the easiest pass through the mountains. Understanding dawned in Liliana's eyes. That's why Uncle William's letter said to hold onto the land. He must have known about the railroad's plans. Garrett's hand clenched around the claim notice. This ends now. The next morning, despite their exhaustion, Garrett and Liliana rode into town together, the evidence of the railroad's underhanded tactics carefully preserved. The sheriff listened to their account, examined the evidence, and promised to investigate, though his expression suggested skepticism about successfully challenging an entity as powerful as the Northern Pacific. As they left the sheriff's office, Garrett spotted Lawrence Hargrove outside the hotel, deep in conversation with two men whose expensive suits marked them as outsiders. Anger surged through him, and before Liliana could stop him, he strode across the street. Hargrove, he called. The railroad man turned, his expression shifting from surprise to calculated pleasantness. Mr. Evans. Miss Whitfield. I heard about the unfortunate fire at the Starlight. A terrible accident. No accident, Garrett said coldly, stopping just short of the man. And we both know it. Hargrove's smile didn't waver. I'm sure I don't know what you're implying. We found your coal oil can, Liliana said, stepping to Garrett's side. And the claim notice, dated before the fire. For a brief moment, Uncertainty flashed in Hargrove's eyes, quickly replaced by cool confidence. Serious accusations require serious evidence. Evidence that would stand up in court. He glanced meaningfully at his companions. And courts tend to favor progress over the complaints of stubborn locals. You think you can just burn us out? Garrett's voice was dangerously low. That will give up and sell cheap? I think, Hargrove said carefully, that fighting progress is futile. The railroad will come through Paradise Valley. The only question is whether you benefit from it or are ruined by it. He turned to Liliana. Miss Whitfield, surely you see reason. A woman alone on the frontier, how long before tragedy strikes? Take the money. Return to civilization. Something hardened in Liliana's expression. I'm not alone, Mr. Hargrove. And we're not selling. The railroad man's facade of pleasantness cracked. Then you're both fools. When the railroad decides on a route, nothing stands in its way. Nothing. Is that a threat? Garrett stepped closer, hand instinctively moving toward his gun. One of Hargrove's companions intervened smoothly. Merely an observation of historical patterns, Mr. Evans. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a meeting with the town council. As the three men walked away, Liliana placed a restraining hand on Garrett's arm. Not here, she murmured. Not like this. The tension in Garrett's body didn't ease, but he nodded stiffly. They won't stop, Liliana. The fire was just the beginning. I know. Her voice was steady, her blue eyes clear and determined. But neither will we. They spent the rest of the day gathering allies, speaking with other ranchers who had received similar pressures, consulting the territory's only lawyer, sending telegrams to officials in Helena who might intervene. By evening, when they finally rode back toward their ranches, a plan had begun to take shape. At the fork in the road where their paths would separate, Garrett reined his horse to a stop. Stay at the Starlight tonight, he said. I don't like the thought of you alone at Willowbrook. Liliana hesitated, then nodded. All right. The simple acceptance, so unlike her usual insistence on independence, revealed her unspoken concerns. The threats were escalating, and neither of them knew what form the next attack might take. That night, after a quiet meal with his hands, Garrett sat with Liliana on the Starlight's porch, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. The day's tensions and schemes had left them both drained, and for a long while, they sat in comfortable silence. My father used to say that land was the only thing worth fighting for, Garrett finally said, his voice low in the gathering darkness. Because they aren't making any more of it. Liliana turned to look at him, her profile silvered by moonlight. Is that why you're helping me? For the land. Garrett met her gaze, suddenly aware of how close she was, how the moonlight caught in her honey-blonde hair and illuminated her face. No, he admitted. Not for the land. Something shifted in her expression, understanding, perhaps, or hope. Garrett, I told myself the frontier was no place for attachments, he continued, the words coming with difficulty after years of guarding his thoughts. That caring for someone was just inviting pain. That I was better off alone with my land and my cattle. And now, she asked softly, now I know I was wrong. He reached out slowly, taking her hand in his. These past months, watching you fight for Willowbrook, working beside you, I've come to realize that surviving isn't the same as living. Liliana's fingers tightened around his. I came west thinking I had to prove I could stand alone, she whispered. I never expected to find someone I'd rather stand beside. The simple honesty of her words broke something open inside Garrett. Gently, he drew her closer, one hand coming up to trace the line of her cheek. When his lips found hers, it felt like coming home after a long, cold journey. The kiss deepened, tender and exploring, conveying all the emotions neither had fully expressed in words. When they finally parted, Garrett rested his forehead against hers, unwilling to move away. I love you, Liliana Whitfield, he said, the words both terrifying and freeing. And whatever comes, railroad men or rustlers or winter storms, I want to face it with you. Tears shimmered in her blue eyes. I love you too, she whispered. More than I ever thought possible. As they held each other on the porch of the ranch he'd once thought was all he needed, Garrett realized how much his world had expanded since Liliana had arrived in Paradise Valley. The fortress he'd built around his heart lay in ruins, and in its place stood something stronger, a future built on love rather than isolation. But as the night deepened around them, He couldn't silence the whisper of fear that loving her made him vulnerable in ways he'd fought for years to avoid. And with Hargrove's threats still hanging over them, that vulnerability had never been more dangerous. The following weeks brought a fragile peace. The letter-writing campaign to territorial officials had yielded results. An inquiry had been opened into the railroad's practices, temporarily halting their more aggressive tactics. With the immediate threat reduced, Garrett and Liliana turned their attention to combining their herds for the Army contract and preparing both ranches for the approaching winter. Their days were filled with work, their evenings with planning and increasingly tender moments together. The ranchers of Paradise Valley had united against the railroad's tactics, forming a protective alliance that made it harder for Hargrove to target any single property. The council meetings tomorrow, Liliana reminded Garrett as they rode the fence line between their properties one crisp November morning. Everyone will be there to oppose the railroad's right-of-way petition. Garrett nodded, though concern still creased his brow. Hargrove's been too quiet. He's planning something. The law's on our side now, Liliana said, though her own expression showed doubt. With the evidence we gathered and the territorial governor's interest. Men like Hargrove don't care about the law, Garrett replied grimly. They care about power and profit. They rode in silence for a while, the mountains rising majestically before them, the valley spread out below. Both their ranches were visible from this ridge, the Starlight with its well-maintained buildings and corrals, Willowbrook showing the results of months of hard work, its structures repaired and painted, cattle grazing peacefully in the pastures. It's beautiful, Liliana said softly, following his gaze. Worth fighting for. Garrett looked at her, the woman who had arrived as a city stranger and become the center of his world. Yes, he agreed, meaning far more than the land. When they reached Willowbrook, Liliana's foreman was waiting with a telegram that had arrived from Helena. She read it quickly, her expression brightening. The governor's sent a special investigator, she told Garrett. He'll be at the council meeting tomorrow. For the first time in weeks, hope seemed to outweigh concern. They spent the afternoon finalizing their presentation for the council, gathering documents and preparing arguments against the railroad's petition. As evening approached, Garrett reluctantly prepared to return to the Starlight. Though he'd have preferred to stay at Willowbrook to ensure Liliana's safety, they'd agreed to maintain propriety, especially with the town meeting approaching and all eyes upon them. I'll meet you at the crossroads at 9 tomorrow, he said as he mounted his horse. We'll ride in together. Liliana nodded, her face illuminated by the golden light of sunset. Be careful, Garrett. He leaned down from the saddle to kiss her briefly. Always am. But as he rode away, the sense of foreboding that had shadowed him for days intensified. Something about the timing, the sudden silence from Hargrove, the convenient arrival of the investigator just before the crucial vote, nagged at him. By the time he reached the Starlight, he'd resolved to return to Willowbrook at first light, unwilling to leave Liliana alone any longer than necessary. The decision came too late. He was awakened before dawn by Marcus pounding on his door. Boss, Willowbrook's on fire. Garrett was on his horse within minutes, riding harder than he'd ever ridden, his heart a thundering drum of fear. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as he crested the ridge between the properties, revealing the horrific scene below. Willowbrook's main house engulfed in flames, figures rushing around with buckets in a futile attempt to control the blaze. Liliana, he shouted as he galloped into the yard, leaping from his horse before it had fully stopped. Where's Miss Whitfield? One of her hands, face blackened with soot, pointed toward the barn. Doc's with her. Cold terror gripped Garrett as he ran to the barn. He found Liliana lying on a makeshift pallet, the local doctor bent over her. Her face was smudged with soot, her honey-blonde hair singed, and a bloody bandage wrapped around her arm. Liliana, he breathed, dropping to his knees beside her. Her eyes fluttered open, focusing on him with visible effort. Garrett, she'll be all right, the doctor said, noting Garrett's expression. Smoke inhalation and a minor burn on her arm. She was lucky, got out before the roof collapsed. Relief made Garrett's limbs weak. He took Liliana's hand gently, careful of her injuries. What happened? Men with masks, she whispered, her voice hoarse from smoke. 4 of them. They poured coal oil around the house, said it was my last warning. Rage surged through Garrett, hot and consuming. Hargrove, Liliana's fingers tightened around his. They took something, Garrett. From my uncle's desk. Papers about the land. Rest now, he urged, smoothing her singed hair back from her forehead. I'll handle this. As the doctor continued tending to her, Garrett stepped outside to survey the devastation. The house was completely destroyed, reduced to a smoldering skeleton of charred timbers. Years of history, Liliana's few treasured possessions from her Eastern life, all gone. Marcus arrived with more men from the Starlight, helping to ensure the fire didn't spread to other buildings. As they worked, Garrett questioned Liliana's hands about what they'd seen, piecing together the attack. Four masked riders had arrived just after midnight, overpowered the man on watch, and systematically set fire to the house after searching through Peterson's old desk. They knew what they were looking for, Garrett concluded grimly. By mid-morning, with the fire fully extinguished and Liliana resting more comfortably, Garrett made his decision. Take Miss Whitfield to the Starlight, he instructed Marcus. Keep men here to watch the property. I'm going to town. The council meeting? Marcus asked. That, and to find Hargrove. Garrett checked his gun, his expression cold. This ends today. Marcus eyed him warily. Boss, don't do anything you can't come back from. Garrett's jaw tightened. Just take care of her. He rode into Paradise Valley with fury simmering beneath his controlled exterior. The town was busier than usual, with ranchers and townspeople gathered for the council meeting. Outside the town hall, Garrett spotted Hargrove with several associates, looking uncharacteristically concerned as they spoke in low voices. Dismounting, Garrett strode directly toward them, hand resting on his gun. Hargrove, the railroad man, turned, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness. Mr. Evans, I heard about the unfortunate fire at Willowbrook. A terrible tragedy. Tragedy. Garrett's voice was dangerously soft as he closed the distance between them. Your men nearly killed Miss Whitfield. Hargrove's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine shock. My men? I assure you, the Northern Pacific does not employ such tactics. Save it, Garrett snarled. Where are the papers your men took? Peterson's land documents. I have no knowledge of any such papers, Hargrove insisted, glancing around nervously at the gathering crowd. Mr. Evans, while I sympathize with your distress, these accusations are completely accurate, interrupted a new voice. All heads turned to see Sheriff Miller approaching with another man, well-dressed, with the bearing of authority. Lawrence Hargrove, the sheriff said formally, this is Judge Wilson, the governor's investigator. He'd like to speak with you about certain telegrams intercepted between you and known criminals in the territory. For the first time, Hargrove's composure fully cracked. What telegrams? I demand to see. All in good time, Judge Wilson said coolly. Along with discussing the forged claim notices found in your hotel room this morning. Garrett watched in stunned silence as Hargrove and two of his associates were taken into custody. The judge turned to him after the railroad men had been escorted to the jail. Mr. Evans, I presume? I've been investigating Mr. Hargrove's activities for some weeks now. Unfortunately, not in time to prevent last night's attack. His expression softened slightly. How is Miss Whitfield? Recovering, Garrett answered, still processing the sudden turn of events. But her home is destroyed. The judge nodded gravely. The council meeting has been postponed until next week. I'd like to speak with both you and Miss Whitfield when she's able. As the crowd dispersed, discussing the dramatic arrest, Garrett felt the adrenaline that had carried him since dawn beginning to ebb. In its place came bone-deep weariness and an overwhelming need to return to Liliana. He was mounting his horse when the town lawyer hurried up to him. Mr. Evans. A moment, please. What is it, Phillips? Garrett asked impatiently. It's about William Peterson's land, Miss Whitfield's property. The lawyer looked excited despite the grim circumstances. The papers that were stolen? I have copies in my office. Peterson filed them with me years ago. What papers? Mineral rights, Phillips explained. Peterson discovered a silver vein on the property, but kept it quiet. That's what the railroad wanted, not just the land for the tracks, but the silver beneath it. Understanding dawned on Garrett. That's why Uncle William told her to hold onto the land in his letter. He knew it would provide for her. The lawyer nodded enthusiastically. With those rights properly filed, Miss Whitfield could sell access to the mining company while keeping her ranch. She'd be wealthy, Mr. Evans. Garrett barely heard the rest of the lawyer's explanation, his mind already racing ahead to what this meant for Liliana and for them. By the time he rode back to the Starlight, the future had reshuffled itself in his mind. He found Liliana resting in his house, her arm bandaged, her face still pale, but her eyes clear. When she saw him, she tried to sit up. "What happened in town?" she asked anxiously. "The council meeting. Hargrove's been arrested," Garrett told her, taking a seat beside the bed and gently taking her uninjured hand. "The governor's investigator caught him with forged claim documents. And there's more." He explained about the silver vein and the mineral rights, watching her expression shift from disbelief to wonder. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Uncle William knew about this all along. Why didn't he develop the mine himself?" "The lawyer thinks he was waiting for the right time and the right price. The railroad complicated things." Garrett squeezed her hand gently. "What matters is that Willowbrook is yours, free and clear. And now you have options." Liliana's blue eyes studied him intently. "Options?" Garrett took a deep breath, forcing himself to say the words that might take her away from him. "With that kind of money, you could rebuild Willowbrook exactly as you want it. Or you could sell the mineral rights and go back east, buy that comfortable house you mentioned." "Is that what you think I should do?" she asked quietly. "Go back east." The thought of her leaving created a physical ache in his chest, but he made himself nod. "You'd be safe there. Comfortable. The frontier's a hard place, Liliana. Last night proved that." She was silent for a long moment, her gaze moving around the simple ranch house that had become her temporary shelter. Finally, she looked back at him, a smile beginning to form on her lips. "I think," she said slowly, "that I'd rather stay and build something here. With you." Hope surged through him. "Even after everything that's happened?" "Especially after everything that's happened." She shifted to face him more fully, wincing slightly at the movement. "When I came west, I was running from failure, trying to prove I could stand alone. But what I found instead was that standing together is infinitely better." Garrett felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "Together, then." "Together," she agreed, her eyes shining. "We could use the silver money to improve both ranches, join the properties, build a future neither of us could create alone." The vision she painted was so close to what he'd been afraid to hope for that Garrett found himself momentarily speechless. Finally, he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Liliana Whitfield," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I came to Paradise Valley believing the frontier was no place for love, that caring for someone only made you vulnerable. You proved me wrong in every possible way." Her smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "And you showed me that independence doesn't have to mean being alone." Garrett reached into his pocket, withdrawing something he'd been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. "I had a whole speech planned," he admitted ruefully. "Was going to take you up to the ridge where you can see both our ranches, get down on one knee properly." Liliana's eyes widened as she realized what he was holding. A simple gold ring with a small sapphire that matched her eyes. "Garrett, I love you," he said simply. "I want to build that future with you, join our lands, our lives, everything. Marry me, Liliana." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and gathered her carefully into his arms, Garrett knew with absolute certainty that the fortress he'd built around his heart hadn't made him stronger. It had only made him lonely. True strength had come in the form of a city woman who had proved as resilient as the Montana wilderness itself, who had taught him that vulnerability wasn't weakness but the foundation of everything worth having. Spring 1873 brought renewal to Paradise Valley. The mountains shed their snowy mantles, creeks swelled with snowmelt, and the land greened with promise. On the ridge between the Starlight and Willowbrook, now joined as a single property known as Starbrook Ranch, a new house stood nearly completed, built from local timber with wide windows that captured views of the entire valley. Liliana stood on the porch, surveying the activity below. Cattle grazed peacefully across the expanded pastures. The silver mine operated discreetly on the far edge of the property, and ranch hands moved efficiently between the barns and corrals. The railroad had finally come through the valley, but along a different route, and on terms the ranchers had helped dictate. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Garrett approaching, his face lighting with the smile he reserved only for her. "The last of the furniture arrived from Helena," he said, coming to stand beside her. The house will be ready by next week. Just in time, Liliana replied, leaning into him as his arms slipped around her waist. Below them, Paradise Valley stretched in all its spring glory, the land they'd fought for now secure. The mining income had allowed them to expand both ranches, implement improvements neither could have afforded alone, and still rebuild Willowbrook's main house as a comfortable home for their expanding workforce. Any regrets? Garrett asked softly, his free hand covering hers where it rested on the porch railing, their wedding rings catching the afternoon light. Liliana turned to face him, taking in the face she'd come to know as well as her own, the strong jaw now relaxed in contentment, the eyes that had once been guarded now open and warm. Not one, she answered truthfully. Even though frontier life nearly got you killed? He pressed, the old fear briefly visible in his expression. She reached up to trace the line of his cheek, a gesture that had become familiar and beloved. That wasn't the frontier, Garrett. That was greed. And we faced it together, just as we'll face whatever comes next. He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm in a gesture that always reminded her of his proposal during her recovery. Together, he agreed. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the valley in gold and crimson, Liliana thought of the journey that had brought her here, from a decorative existence in Boston society to a life of purpose and love in the Montana wilderness. She had come west seeking independence and found something far more precious: partnership with a man who valued her strength rather than feared it. Mrs. Evans, Garrett murmured, drawing her closer. Have I told you today how much I love you? Liliana smiled up at him, her heart full. Tell me again. As his lips met hers, warm and familiar yet still thrilling, Liliana knew that the true wealth of Starbrook Ranch couldn't be measured in acres or cattle or silver. It lay in the love they'd built together, a love strong enough to survive the harshest frontier, resilient enough to weather any storm, and deep enough to transform two solitary souls into a family that would endure for generations in Paradise Valley.